The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured grounds of Kensington Palace as Prince William stood at his office window, his hands clasped behind his back. The weight of recent events pressed heavily on his shoulders, and the silence in the room seemed to echo the turmoil brewing in the media outside. It was March 2023, and the royal family found itself at the center of yet another storm that threatened to shake the very foundations of the monarchy. Kate Middleton, now the Princess of Wales, sat quietly at the antique oak desk that had belonged to Queen Mary decades earlier. Her fingers traced the edge of a letter that had arrived that morning, its contents still fresh in her mind. The correspondence was from a mental health organization they had been working with, but it wasn't the usual update or invitation. Instead, it contained heartbreaking statistics about suicide rates among young people, particularly those who felt voiceless in their struggles. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here they were, two of the most photographed and talked about people in the world, yet they were grappling with their own form of silence. The palace machinery had always operated on carefully crafted statements, measured responses, and strategic timing. But sometimes, William thought as he turned from the window, the most powerful response was no response at all. The previous week had been particularly challenging. A series of inflammatory comments from a distant royal relative had dominated headlines, overshadowing the important charitable work that William and Kate had been dedicating their lives to. The palace communications team had been in overdrive, drafting responses, scheduling meetings, and trying to control a narrative that seemed determined to spiral out of control. Kate looked up from the letter, her green eyes meeting William's blue ones across the room. They had learned to communicate volumes without saying a word, a skill developed through years of public scrutiny and private challenges. In that moment, they both understood that something needed to change in how they approached their public role. "The children asked me yesterday why there were so many cameras outside their school," Kate said softly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Her voice carried the weight of a mother's concern, mixed with the frustration of someone who had spent over a decade learning to navigate the impossible balance between public duty and private life. William moved away from the window and settled into the chair across from his wife. The morning light highlighted the fine lines around his eyes, evidence of the stress that came with his position. At 41, he had already lived more of his life in the public eye than out of it, but parenthood had added new dimensions to every decision they made. "What did you tell them?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Kate had always been remarkably good at explaining complex situations to their three children in ways that protected their innocence while preparing them for the realities of their unique position. "I told them that sometimes people are very interested in our family, and that it's important for us to focus on the good work we're trying to do," Kate replied. "But George looked at me with those eyes are so much like yours, and I could see he didn't quite believe that was the whole story." Their eldest son, Prince George, was 10 years old and increasingly aware of his family's unusual circumstances. Princess Charlotte, 8, was naturally curious about everything, while 6-year-old Prince Louis remained blissfully unaware of most of the external pressures surrounding their family. It was George's growing awareness that concerned his parents most. The letter on the desk seemed to call for their attention again. The mental health organization had been documenting cases where young people felt their voices didn't matter, where they believed that speaking up about their struggles would either be ignored or misunderstood. The statistics were sobering. 1 in 4 young people reported feeling that their mental health concerns were dismissed by adults in their lives. Kate picked up the letter and read aloud a particular passage that had struck her. "Many of our young clients express that they feel most heard not when adults offer quick solutions or immediate responses, but when someone simply sits with them in their pain and acknowledges it without trying to fix it immediately." William leaned back in his chair, processing the words. Throughout their marriage, he and Kate had championed various causes, from environmental conservation to early childhood development. But their most passionate work had always been in mental health advocacy, partly inspired by William's own journey of processing his mother's death and the years of therapy that had helped him heal. The palace phone rang, interrupting their thoughts. Kate glanced at the caller ID and saw was their private secretary, likely calling about the day's schedule and the ongoing media situation. She let it ring through to voicemail, making a conscious choice to preserve this moment of reflection and connection with her husband. "You know what strikes me most about this letter?" William said, gesturing toward the document in Kate's hands. "It's that these young people are teaching us something about communication that we've never really considered in our official capacity." Kate nodded, understanding immediately where his thoughts were heading. The power of presence over words. "Exactly," William continued. "We're always being asked to comment, to respond, to issue statements. But what if sometimes the most powerful thing we could do is simply show up and be present with people without feeling the need to have all the right words?" This wasn't a completely new concept for them personally. In their private visits to hospitals, homeless shelters, and community centers, some of their most meaningful interactions had been wordless moments, holding someone's hand, sitting quietly with a grieving parent, or simply listening without judgment. But translating that approach to their public role seemed revolutionary. Kate stood and walked to the bookshelf that lined one wall of the office. Among the leather-bound volumes and official documents were personal photos, candid shots of their family, pictures from their university days, and images from charitable visits that never made it to the press. One photo, in particular, caught her attention, a picture of William sitting on the floor of a children's hospital, not speaking, just stacking blocks with a young patient who was too sick to carry on a conversation. "Remember this day?" she asked, bringing the photo to William. "You spent 2 hours with that little boy, and you barely spoke." But his mother told me later that it was the first time she'd seen him smile in weeks. William took the photo, studying it carefully. He remembered that visit vividly. The child, Thomas, was 5 years old and battling leukemia. The doctors had warned that he might not have much energy for a typical royal visit with handshakes and conversation. Instead, William had simply sat down on the floor and followed Thomas's lead. They had built towers with blocks, colored in a coloring book, and sat in comfortable silence when Thomas needed to rest. His mother also said something else that day. Kate continued. She said that most people, even well-meaning visitors, felt the need to fill the silence with positive talk about getting better and looking forward to the future. But Thomas was living in the moment, dealing with each day as it came. Your willingness to just be present with him in that reality meant everything to her. The memory sparked something in William's mind. He thought about his own childhood, particularly the periods after his mother's death when well-meaning adults had overwhelmed him with words of comfort that felt hollow. What had helped him most were the people who had simply been present, his father during their long walks at Balmoral, his grandmother during quiet afternoons at Windsor, and later his therapist who had taught him that healing didn't always require talking. "I think you might be onto something important here," William said, setting the photo down gently. "Not just for us, but for how the monarchy might evolve to better serve people who are struggling." Kate returned to her seat, her mind racing with possibilities. The traditional model has always been about appearances and statements. Show up, say the right things, move on to the next engagement. But what if we could create spaces for genuine human connection instead? They began to envision a different approach to their royal duties. Instead of rushed visits with carefully choreographed interactions, they could advocate for longer, more meaningful engagements. Rather than feeling pressure to have immediate responses to every crisis or controversy, they could model the value of thoughtful reflection and authentic presence. The idea wasn't without its challenges. The palace machinery was built around efficiency and protocol. The media expected quick responses and sound bites. The public was accustomed to seeing their royals in a certain way. But both William and Kate had reached a point in their lives where authenticity felt more important than convenience. As the morning progressed, their conversation deepened. They discussed specific ways they could implement this philosophy in their upcoming engagements. There was a visit scheduled to a suicide prevention center the following week, and another to a school where bullying had become a serious problem. Instead of the usual format of brief meetings with administrators followed by photo opportunities, they could request longer, less structured time with the people most directly affected by these issues. Kate pulled out her laptop and began researching organizations that specialized in trauma-informed approaches to support. She discovered methodologies used by therapists and social workers that prioritize presence and validation over immediate problem solving. The more she read, the more convinced she became that they were approaching something that could genuinely revolutionize how the royal family engaged with social issues. "Listen to this," she said, reading from an article about trauma-informed care. "When someone is in crisis, the most healing response is often not to try to fix their situation immediately, but to help them feel seen, heard, and validated in their experience. This creates the emotional safety necessary for real healing to begin." William thought about the various crises the royal family had faced over the years. Too often, the response had been defensive statements, justifications, or quick fixes that addressed the surface issues, but ignored the deeper hurt that people were expressing. What if, instead, they had started by simply acknowledging the pain that others were experiencing? The concept felt both revolutionary and ancient. It harkened back to the most fundamental aspects of human compassion while challenging modern expectations of constant communication and instant responses. In a world where everyone seemed to be talking, perhaps the most radical act was to sometimes simply listen. As they continued their discussion, Kate remembered a conversation she'd had with her own mother years earlier, during the intense media scrutiny that had surrounded their courtship. Carol Middleton had advised her daughter that sometimes the strongest response to criticism was a graceful silence that allowed others to reveal their own character while preserving one's own dignity. "My mother told me something once that I think applies here," Kate shared. "She said that people who are hurting often don't need us to have all the answers. They need us to care enough to sit with them in their questions." This philosophy began to crystallize into a concrete plan. They would approach their upcoming engagements differently, requesting more time and less structure. They would train themselves to be comfortable with silence, to resist the urge to fill every moment with words. Most importantly, they would focus on being fully present with the people they met, rather than thinking ahead to the next engagement or the inevitable media coverage. The decision felt both exciting and terrifying. It meant stepping away from the safety of scripted interactions and prepared statements. It meant being vulnerable in a way that the royal family had rarely allowed itself to be. But it also felt like a return to the most authentic aspects of service and leadership. As the morning turned to afternoon, William and Kate found themselves planning not just a new approach to their royal duties, but a fundamental shift in how they understood their role in the world. They were moving from being figureheads who provided comfort through their mere presence and carefully chosen words, to becoming leaders who offered healing through genuine human connection and authentic presence. The letter from the mental health organization remained on the desk, but it was no longer just a piece of correspondence. It had become the catalyst for what both William and Kate sensed would be one of the most important evolutions in their approach to royal service. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable or heavy with unspoken concerns. Instead, it had become pregnant with possibility and purpose. 3 weeks later, Prince William and Kate found themselves standing outside St. Margaret's Crisis Support Center in Liverpool, a modest brick building that housed one of the most innovative suicide prevention programs in the United Kingdom. Unlike their usual arrivals, there were no red carpets, no ceremonial fanfare, and no crowd of officials waiting to greet them. Instead, they had requested what the palace staff had initially considered an unusual arrangement: an unscheduled, extended visit with minimal media presence and maximum time for genuine interaction. Dr. Sarah Chun, the center's director, met them at the side entrance. A woman in her mid-40s with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She had initially been skeptical when the royal visit was proposed. Too many high-profile visits in her experience had been superficial affairs that disrupted the center's work without providing meaningful benefit to the people they served. But something in the way William and Kate's team had approached this visit had been different. "Your Highnesses," Dr. Chan began, but William gently interrupted. Please, just William and Kate today. We're here to learn, not to be formal guests. Kate nodded in agreement, adjusting the simple navy cardigan she had chosen specifically to blend in rather than stand out. They had both dressed down considerably from their usual royal attire, understanding that their appearance could either create barriers or build bridges with the people they were hoping to meet. Dr. Chun led them through a hallway lined with artwork created by the center's clients. The pieces range from abstract paintings that seemed to swirl with emotional turmoil to simple pencil drawings of everyday objects that somehow conveyed profound hope. Kate paused before one particular piece, a charcoal drawing of hands reaching toward each other across what appeared to be a vast, dark space. That was created by Marcus, Dr. Chun explained quietly. He's 17 and came to us 3 months ago after his third suicide attempt. Art therapy has become his primary way of processing his experiences because he struggles with verbal communication about his trauma. William studied the drawing more closely, noticing the incredible detail in the hands and the way the artist had used shading to suggest both distance and connection. Is he someone we might be able to meet today? Actually, yes. He specifically asked to be included when he heard about your visit. But I should warn you, Marcus communicates very differently than what you might expect. He often goes long periods without speaking, and when he does talk, it's usually in very short sentences. Some visitors find the silence uncomfortable. Kate and William exchanged a meaningful look. "We'd be honored to spend time with him," Kate said, "and we're perfectly comfortable with silence." Dr. Chin's eyebrows raised slightly, intrigued by the response. In her experience, most dignitaries felt compelled to fill every moment with conversation, often missing the more subtle forms of communication that her clients use to express themselves. They continued through the center, visiting the group therapy room where circle of chairs sat empty, but somehow still held the weight of the conversations that took place there daily. Dr. Chun explained that traditional therapy didn't work for everyone who came to the center. Some people needed different approaches: art, music, gardening, or simply having a safe space to exist without judgment. "We've learned that healing isn't always about talking," she continued as they walked. "Sometimes it's about feeling heard, even when you can't find words. Sometimes it's about having someone witness your pain without trying to fix it immediately." Her words echoed the conversation William and Kate had been having for weeks. They had spent considerable time studying trauma-informed approaches and consulting with mental health professionals about how to make their royal visits more meaningful. The consensus had been clear. Presence often mattered more than words, and authentic connection required patience that most official engagements didn't allow. They entered a large, comfortable room filled with mismatched furniture that somehow created an atmosphere of warmth and acceptance. Soft natural light filtered through large windows, and plants lined the windowsills. A small group of young people was gathered there, some working on art projects, others reading, and a few simply sitting quietly. Marcus was immediately recognizable from his artwork style. He sat in a corner chair, sketching in a notebook, his dark hair falling across his face. He looked up when they entered, but didn't speak, simply nodding acknowledgement before returning to his drawing. Dr. Chun made brief introductions, explaining to the group that William and Kate had come to learn about their experiences and the work of the center. She emphasized that participation in any conversation was entirely optional, and that people were free to continue with their activities or leave the room if they preferred. Instead of launching into questions or prepared remarks, William and Kate simply found seats in the circle. Kate chose a spot near an 18-year-old named Amy who was working on a complex embroidery project, while William sat closer to Marcus, but not so close as to intrude on his space. The first few minutes were indeed silent. Amy continued her embroidery, the soft sound of thread pulling through fabric creating a gentle rhythm. Marcus kept sketching. 2 other young people continued reading their books. Another girl named Sophie sat with her eyes closed, listening to music through earbuds. For most visitors, this would have been an awkward moment requiring immediate intervention. But William and Kate had prepared themselves for exactly this scenario. They had learned that jumping into conversation could be interpreted as impatience or discomfort with the authentic reality of these young people's experiences. After about 5 minutes, Amy looked up from her embroidery. "This is usually when people start asking us how we're doing," she said with a slight smile. "But that's not really why you're here, is it?" Kate considered the question carefully before responding. "We're here because we want to understand better how to support people who are struggling. Not in a theoretical way, but in a real, practical way. And we've been learning that sometimes the best support doesn't involve having all the right words." Marcus looked up from his notebook, making brief eye contact with William before returning to his sketch. But something in his posture suggested he was listening intently to the conversation. Sophie removed her earbuds. "Most adults want us to be okay, so they can feel better about themselves," she said matter-of-factly. "They want us to say that we're making progress or that we're grateful for their help. But sometimes we're not okay, and that's okay too." Her words hung in the air, profound in their simplicity. William thought about the countless royal visits where he and Kate had been given success stories and positive updates, carefully curated to present an uplifting narrative. This was different. This was honest. "Tell us about that," William said gently. "What does it feel like when people need you to be okay?" "Exhausting," Amy replied without hesitation. "It's like having to perform recovery instead of actually experiencing it. You end up taking care of other people's discomfort with your pain instead of focusing on your own healing." The conversation that followed was unlike any William and Kate had experienced in their royal roles. It wasn't structured or time-limited. People spoke when they felt moved to share something and remained silent when they needed to process. Marcus contributed to the discussion primarily through his art, occasionally showing his notebook to others when a drawing captured something he couldn't express in words. Dr. Chun observed from the edge of the room, taking notes not about what was being said, but about the quality of the interaction. She had seen hundreds of meetings between her clients and various visitors over the years, but rarely had she witnessed such a natural flow of authentic communication. As the hour progressed, more people joined the conversation. A young man named David shared his experience of feeling pressure to get better on other people's timelines rather than his own. A girl named Emma talked about how much it meant when someone could simply acknowledge that her situation was genuinely difficult without immediately offering solutions or silver linings. Kate found herself thinking about her own experiences with public scrutiny and mental health challenges. During the early years of her relationship with William, she had struggled with anxiety and the pressure of constant judgment. What had helped her most hadn't been people telling her to be strong or that everything would work out, but those who had simply acknowledged that her experience was genuinely challenging. "I think," Kate said during a lull in the conversation, "that most of us have been taught that caring means trying to fix things. But what you're describing sounds like caring means being willing to stay present with people even when we can't fix their situation." "Yes," Sophie said with more energy than she had shown all afternoon. "That's exactly it. It's the difference between someone caring about you and someone caring for you. Caring about us means you're invested in our well-being. Caring for us means you're willing to be uncomfortable alongside us while we figure things out." Marcus suddenly spoke for the first time since they had arrived. "My parents care about me," he said quietly. "But they can't care for me because my pain makes them too scared." The statement was simple but profound, and it created a moment of recognition among everyone in the room. William thought about his own experience after his mother's death, when many adults around him had been so focused on helping him move on that they had struggled to simply be present with his grief. "What does it look like when someone cares for you in the way you need?" William asked. Marcus thought for a moment, then flipped to a fresh page in his notebook. Instead of drawing, he wrote something and showed it to the group. "They don't need me to be different than I am right now." The simplicity and wisdom of the statement settled over the room like a gentle weight. Amy nodded vigorously. "That's it exactly. They don't need our pain to make sense to them. They don't need us to hurry up and heal. They just need us to be ourselves, even when ourselves is messy or broken or scared." Dr. Chen had stopped taking notes entirely and was simply watching the interaction unfold. In her professional experience, this level of authentic sharing usually took months to develop in group therapy settings. There was something about William and Kate's approach that had created safety for these young people to express themselves more openly than they typically did with new people. As the afternoon continued, the conversation organically shifted to practical questions about mental health support. But instead of theoretical policy discussions, they talked about specific experiences and real needs. Emma described how helpful it had been when a teacher had simply acknowledged her struggle with depression instead of immediately referring her to guidance counseling. David talked about friends who had learned to check in with him without expecting particular responses. The thing is, Amy said, working a particularly complex section of her embroidery, most people think that if they can't make us feel better right away, they're failing. But that's not how healing works. Healing happens in relationship, over time, with people who can handle our reality. William found himself thinking about the institutional pressures he and Kate faced in their royal roles. There was always pressure to have immediate positive impact, to solve problems, and create inspiring narratives. But what these young people were teaching them was that sometimes the most helpful thing was to resist the pressure for quick solutions and instead commit to sustained, authentic relationship. "Can I ask you something?" Kate said, addressing the group. When people in positions of influence, whether that's teachers, parents, politicians, or even people like us, want to genuinely help with mental health issues, what's the most important thing we should understand? The question prompted another thoughtful silence. Finally, Sophie answered, "Understand that we're the experts on our own experience. You might be experts on policy or resources or best practices, but we're the experts on what it actually feels like to live with these struggles. Real help happens when you combine your expertise with ours." Marcus had returned to drawing while listening to the conversation, but he looked up to add, "And understand that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we're not okay. When you make it easy for us to do that, you're giving us permission to be human." The profundity of these insights wasn't lost on William and Kate. They had come to the center thinking they would be offering support and encouragement to young people in crisis. Instead, they were receiving education about authenticity, presence, and the true nature of helpful support that would fundamentally change how they approach their royal duties. As the official end time for the visit approached, no one seemed eager to transition to closing remarks or formal conclusions. The conversation had developed its own natural rhythm, and interrupting it would have felt artificial. William made a decision that surprised even their security detail. "Would it be possible for us to stay a bit longer?" he asked Dr. Chun. "This feels too important to cut short." Dr. Chun smiled, recognizing something she had rarely seen in high-profile visitors, a genuine willingness to prioritize the relationship over the schedule. "Of course, this is exactly the kind of flexibility that real connection requires." The extended afternoon at St. Margaret's Crisis Support Center stretched into early evening, with the natural light from the windows gradually giving way to the warm glow of table lamps. What had begun as a formal royal visit had transformed into something unprecedented, a genuine community gathering where hierarchy seemed to dissolve in favor of authentic human connection. As the group continued their conversation, other residents of the center began to drift into the room. Word had spread that something unusual was happening, not the typical brief royal visit with photo opportunities and prepared remarks, but an extended, open dialogue where real stories were being shared and heard. Dr. Chen found herself in uncharted territory. Her years of experience running crisis support programs had taught her to be protective of her clients' emotional energy, especially during high-profile visits that could become performative rather than therapeutic. But what was unfolding felt different. The young people were engaging from a place of strength rather than vulnerability, sharing their experiences as teachers rather than subjects of charity. Maria, a 19-year-old who had been at the center for 6 months, entered the room cautiously. She had specifically chosen not to participate in the official visit, having had negative experiences with media attention in the past. But something about the quiet, sustained nature of the conversation drew her in. "Is it okay if I listen for a while?" she asked, addressing the question to the group, rather than to William and Kate specifically. "Of course," Amy replied, making space for Maria to join their circle. "We've been talking about what it means to really support someone who's struggling." Maria settled into a chair and observed the dynamics for several minutes before speaking. What struck her was how comfortable everyone seemed with the pauses in conversation, the way thoughts were allowed to develop naturally without rushing to fill every silence with words. "I've been thinking about what Marcus said earlier," Maria eventually contributed, "about people needing us to be different than we are right now. I think that's why so many support systems fail, because they're built on the assumption that our current state is a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be supported." Her observation sparked a deeper discussion about the difference between support systems that aim to eliminate distress and those that focused on building resilience and coping capacity. William found himself thinking about the various charitable organizations he and Kate supported, wondering how many operated from the first assumption rather than the second. Kate had been largely quiet for the past hour, not because she wasn't engaged, but because she was learning to distinguish between productive participation and the habitual need to contribute that came with her public role. She had noticed that some of the most powerful moments in the conversation had emerged from silence, spaces where people could process what had been shared before responding. "Maria, can you help us understand what support that honors your current reality looks like in practice?" Kate asked when it felt natural to do so. Maria considered the question carefully. "Well, for me, it started with having people who could handle hearing about my actual experience without needing to make it better immediately. When I first came here, I was cutting myself and having pretty regular panic attacks. Instead of focusing on stopping those behaviors right away, the staff here helped me understand what those behaviors were doing for me, how they were actually coping strategies, even if they weren't healthy ones." She paused, looking around the room to gauge whether her honesty was creating discomfort. Finding only attentive, accepting faces, she continued. "Once I understood that my self-harm wasn't random or crazy, but was actually my brain's attempt to manage overwhelming feelings, I could start developing better strategies. But that only worked because people here were willing to start from where I actually was, not from where they thought I should be." William leaned forward slightly, drawn into the explanation. "That must have required tremendous courage on your part, to be that honest about your experience." "It did," Maria agreed. "But it was easier to be brave when I knew that my honesty wouldn't be met with panic or judgment. The staff here are trained to hear difficult things without falling apart, which meant I didn't have to take care of their emotions while I was working on mine. This concept, the idea that support providers needed to be emotionally prepared to witness pain without immediately trying to fix it, was revolutionizing William and Kate's understanding of their royal role. They began to see how many of their official engagements were structured in ways that protected them and their staff from the full weight of the issues they were meant to be addressing. Sophie, who had been listening intently, added her perspective. "What Maria is describing is basically emotional safety. It's knowing that you can be honest about your reality without having to manage other people's reactions to it. Most adults haven't learned how to provide that kind of safety because they were never given it themselves." The conversation was interrupted by a gentle knock on the door. Dr. Chen's assistant entered to inform them that their security detail was becoming concerned about the extended timeline and the approaching evening. William and Kate exchanged glances, recognizing the pull of their official obligations while feeling reluctant to end what had become one of the most meaningful exchanges of their royal career. "We understand the security concerns," Williams said to Dr. Chen, "but would it be possible to find a compromise? This conversation feels too important to cut short." After a brief consultation with their protection team, it was arranged that they could continue for another hour with some additional security precautions. The decision to prioritize the relationship over the schedule sent a clear message to everyone in the room about William and Kate's commitment to genuine engagement over ceremonial obligation. As the evening progressed, the conversation naturally evolved toward practical applications. The young people began sharing specific examples of interactions that had been helpful or harmful in their healing journeys. David described a teacher who had saved his life simply by noticing changes in his behavior and asking, "How are you really doing?" in a way that conveyed genuine interest rather than polite formality. Emma talked about a family friend who had learned to check in with her regularly without expecting particular responses or improvements. She would text me things like, "Thinking of you today," or "Here if you need me," without requiring me to respond or update her on how I was doing. It let me know I mattered to her without adding pressure to perform recovery. Marcus, who had been sketching throughout the conversation, suddenly shared his notebook again. This time, he had created a two-panel drawing. The first panel showed a person drowning, with multiple hands reaching down from above. The second panel showed the same drowning person, but with one person jumping into the water alongside them. "Most help feels like the first picture," he explained quietly. "People trying to pull you out from a safe distance. But real help feels like the second picture, someone willing to get in the water with you." The image was so powerful that it rendered the room silent for several moments. William studied the drawing, thinking about his own experiences of grief and trauma. The people who had been most helpful to him hadn't been those who had tried to pull him quickly through his pain, but those who had been willing to accompany him in it. Kate found herself thinking about their upcoming royal engagements and how they might apply these insights. They had a visit scheduled to a domestic violence shelter, another to a veteran support center, and a third to a school dealing with high rates of student anxiety. Each of these visits had been planned according to traditional royal protocol: brief meetings, uplifting interactions, and positive photo opportunities. "Can I ask you all something?" Kate said during a natural pause in the conversation. "If people in positions of influence wanted to visit your communities or organizations in ways that were actually helpful rather than just ceremonial, what would that look like?" The question prompted an animated discussion. Amy suggested that meaningful visits required genuine time, enough time for real relationships to develop rather than just polite exchanges. Sophie emphasized the importance of visitors being prepared to hear difficult truths without needing to immediately offer solutions. "The best visits are when people come to learn rather than to help," Maria added. "When they're genuinely curious about our experience and expertise rather than assuming they know what we need." David brought up the importance of follow-through. A lot of high-profile visits are one-time things that feel good in the moment, but don't lead to any real change. The visits that matter are part of ongoing relationships. As they talked, William and Kate began envisioning a completely different approach to their royal duties. Instead of packed schedules with multiple brief engagements, they could advocate for fewer, longer visits that allowed for genuine connection. Rather than being briefed on success stories and positive outcomes, they could request honest assessments of challenges and ongoing needs. The conversation was again interrupted, this time by the arrival of several parents who had come to pick up their children from the center's evening programs. Dr. Chen had been concerned about how these parents might react to finding the Prince and Princess of Wales engaged in an extended, informal conversation with their children. But what unfolded surprised everyone. Marcus's mother, arriving to collect him, paused in the doorway when she saw the gathering. Instead of the formal interaction she might have expected, she found her son engaged in animated conversation about his artwork with Prince William, who was examining Marcus's drawings with genuine interest and asking thoughtful questions about his creative process. "I've never seen him so comfortable talking to new people," Marcus's mother whispered to Dr. Chen. The transformation in her son, from the withdrawn, silent young man who had entered the program 3 months earlier to someone confidently sharing his perspectives with royalty, was remarkable. Emma's father had a similar reaction. His daughter had struggled with selective mutism related to her anxiety, but here she was articulating complex thoughts about mental health support with clarity and confidence. The safe, accepting environment that had been created seemed to bring out strengths in these young people that their parents rarely got to witness. Rather than ending the gathering, The arrival of the parents created an opportunity for an even richer conversation. The adults found themselves learning alongside William and Kate about their children's insights and experiences. For many of the parents, it was the first time they had heard their children speak so openly about their mental health challenges. "I had no idea Emma understood her anxiety so clearly," her father said to the group. "At home, she struggles to explain what she's feeling, but listening to her here, I realize she's been trying to tell us things that we weren't prepared to hear." This led to another profound discussion about the barriers to communication that exist within families dealing with mental health challenges. The young people shared their perspectives on what made it difficult to be honest with their parents about their struggles, while the parents talked about their own fears and feelings of helplessness. Sophie's mother revealed that she had been so afraid of saying the wrong thing that she had started avoiding meaningful conversations with her daughter altogether. "I was so worried about making things worse that I ended up making her feel alone," she admitted. "But you're here now," Sophie replied gently. "And you're listening. That means everything to me." The interactions between the families were providing William and Kate with yet another layer of understanding about mental health support. They were witnessing firsthand how healing happened not through expert intervention, but through authentic relationship and sustained presence. As the evening drew to a close, the natural endpoint felt very different from the typical conclusion of a royal visit. Instead of formal farewells and official closing remarks, there was a sense of genuine sadness at parting combined with gratitude for the depth of connection that had been achieved. Marcus approached William before leaving, holding out his notebook. "I want you to have this," he said simply, "to remember what you learned here." The gesture was so unexpected and meaningful that William found himself momentarily speechless. In all his years of royal visits, he had received countless ceremonial gifts and mementos, but nothing had ever felt as significant as this young man's artistic documentation of their shared experience. "Thank you, Marcus," William finally managed. "This means more to me than I can express. Would it be all right if I stayed in touch with Dr. Chan to hear about your progress?" Marcus nodded, then added quietly, "Will you really remember what we talked about when you go back to being royal?" The question went to the heart of the challenge William and Kate were facing: how to maintain the authenticity and depth they had experienced here while navigating the demands and expectations of their official roles. "We won't forget," Kate answered, speaking for both of them. "And we're going to work very hard to figure out how to bring what we've learned here into everything else we do." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Chen pulled William and Kate aside for a private conversation. "In 20 years of running this program, I've never seen anything like what happened here today. These young people shared more authentically and engaged more openly than they typically do, even in their regular therapy sessions. Whatever you did differently from other official visits, it worked." William and Kate looked at each other, recognizing the profound shift that had occurred not just in their approach to this visit, but in their understanding of their entire purpose as public figures. They had discovered something revolutionary, that their most powerful impact might come not from their ability to provide solutions, but from their willingness to be fully present with people in their struggles. 6 months after their transformative experience at St. Margaret's Crisis Support Center, Prince William and Kate found themselves facing the most significant challenge of their royal career. The lessons they had learned about presence, authenticity, and the power of silence were about to be tested on the world's largest stage. It was a crisp October morning when they received the call from Buckingham Palace. There had been a tragic incident at a secondary school in Manchester. A 15-year-old student named James Mitchell had taken his own life after months of struggling with bullying and mental health challenges. The school community was devastated, parents were demanding answers, and the media was calling for immediate royal response to what they were labeling a youth mental health crisis. The traditional protocol would have involved a carefully crafted statement expressing sympathy, followed by a brief visit to lay flowers and meet with school officials. The palace communications team had already drafted a response and scheduled a standard ceremonial visit that would last exactly 2 hours, designed to show royal concern while minimizing disruption to the school's operations. But William and Kate had spent the past 6 months fundamentally reimagining their approach to such situations. They had continued their relationship with St. Margaret's Center, making several unscheduled return visits, and maintaining regular contact with Dr. Chun and the young people they had met. More importantly, they had been quietly implementing their new philosophy of presence-based support across all their engagements. The changes hadn't gone unnoticed within palace circles. Some staff members were frustrated by what they saw as inefficient use of time, as William and Kate began requesting longer visits with fewer scheduled activities. Others worried about the potential for negative media coverage when the royal couple spent extended time with challenging situations rather than focusing on positive, uplifting stories. But the results had been undeniable. The organizations they visited reported unprecedented levels of meaningful engagement. Young people who had previously been too intimidated or skeptical to participate in royal visits were eagerly sharing their stories. Most importantly, William and Kate themselves felt more fulfilled and authentic in their roles than they had in years. Now, facing the tragedy in Manchester, they knew that their new approach would be put to its ultimate test. This wasn't a planned visit to a support center where everyone was prepared for deeper conversation. This was a crisis situation where emotions were raw, blame was being assigned, and everyone was looking for someone to make sense of senseless loss. "We could follow the standard protocol," Kate said as they sat in their private study, reviewing the briefing materials about James Mitchell's death. "It would be safer, more predictable." William looked at the photograph of James that had been included in their briefing, a smiling teenager with braces and unruly dark hair, captured at what appeared to be a family celebration. The image reminded him painfully of his own school photos, of the vulnerability and hope that every young person carried regardless of their outward circumstances. But would it honor what James needed? William replied. Would it honor what his family and friends need now? They had learned from their work with Dr. Chun and the young people at St. Margaret's that crisis situations often call for the opposite of what felt institutionally comfortable. Instead of quick reassurance and moving on, real healing required sitting with the pain, acknowledging the complexity, and resisting the urge to make everything feel better immediately. Kate picked up her phone and called Dr. Chun directly, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier when all communication went through official palace channels. "Sarah, we need your advice," Kate said when Dr. Chun answered. "We're dealing with a suicide at a school in Manchester, and we want to respond in a way that's actually helpful rather than just ceremonial. What should we be thinking about?" Dr. Chin's guidance was clear and challenging. The most important thing is to avoid making the visit about providing comfort or closure, because those aren't realistic goals in acute grief. Instead, focus on bearing witness to the community's pain and showing them that their reality, however difficult, is worthy of sustained attention. She continued, "Also, be prepared for anger. When a young person dies by suicide, there's often enormous anger. At the school, at other students, at mental health systems, sometimes even at the young person who died. Your job isn't to diffuse that anger or redirect it into something more comfortable. Your job is to acknowledge that the anger makes sense and that it's part of the grief process." Armed with this perspective, William and Kate made a decision that sent ripples through the palace hierarchy. Instead of the planned 2-hour visit, they requested permission to spend an entire day in Manchester, with the flexibility to extend longer if needed. Rather than meeting only with school administrators and selected students, they asked to be available to anyone in the school community who wanted to share their thoughts or feelings. Most controversially, they requested that no official statements be prepared in advance. Instead, they would respond to the situation based on what they learned from the people most directly affected by the loss. The palace communications team was horrified. What if someone blames the royal family for not doing enough about youth mental health? They worried. What if angry parents say things that reflect poorly on the monarchy? What if the media interprets extended silence as indifference? But William and Kate had learned to distinguish between protecting the institution and serving the people the institution was meant to support. If people are angry, then our job is to hear that anger, Williams said firmly. If they blame us for not doing enough, maybe that's because we haven't done enough. And if the media doesn't understand the value of sustained presence, that's an education opportunity. On the morning of their visit to Manchester, William and Kate arrived at Oakwood Secondary School to find a community in profound pain. James Mitchell had been a quiet, artistic student who had struggled with social anxiety and had become the target of persistent bullying. His death had shattered the illusion that the school was successfully supporting all its students, and guilt was ricocheting through the entire community. Rather than beginning with meetings with school officials, William and Kate asked to start their visit in the art room, where James had spent much of his free time. The space had been transformed into an informal memorial, with students and teachers adding drawings, poems, and messages to a large collaborative piece that covered one entire wall. The art teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, was initially nervous about hosting the royal visitors in what felt like such a raw, unstructured environment. But William and Kate immediately put her at ease by asking not for explanations or guided tours, but simply for permission to observe and learn. They spent the first hour mostly in silence, studying the memorial art and reading the messages that James's classmates had written. Some of the contributions were heartbreaking expressions of guilt, students wondering if they could have done more to help him. Others were angry denunciations of the bullies who had tormented him. Still others were beautiful tributes to his creativity and kindness. "He drew this last week," said a girl named Sarah, pointing to a small sketch tucked into one corner of the memorial. The drawing showed a bird with a broken wing, but instead of lying helpless, the bird was using its good wing to help other injured creatures. "James always drew things like that," added her friend Michael. "Hurt things helping other hurt things. I think it's how he saw himself." The simplicity and wisdom of this insight struck both William and Kate. They were beginning to understand that James hadn't been just a victim of bullying, but a young person who had been actively trying to cope with and transcend his pain through his art and his care for others. As word spread through the school that the royal visitors were genuinely interested in learning about James rather than just offering condolences, more students began joining them in the art room. What emerged was a complex portrait of a young man who had been struggling, yes, but who had also been contributing to his community in ways that many adults had never recognized. "James helped me with my anxiety," shared a younger student named David. "When I was having panic attacks in the hallway, he would sit with me and show me breathing techniques he had learned. He never made me feel weird about it. He used to leave encouraging drawings in people's lockers," added another girl. Anonymous ones, but we all knew they were from him. "I kept every single one." These stories revealed something that the official school reports about James's death had missed. He hadn't been simply a victim of circumstances, but an active agent in his own life and the lives of others, even while struggling with his mental health challenges. William and Kate found themselves learning not just about James, but about the entire ecosystem of support and failure that had surrounded him. Students talked about teachers who had tried to help, but hadn't known how to address the systemic issues of bullying and social exclusion. They discussed peer support networks that had been informal and largely invisible to adults. They shared their own mental health struggles and how James's death had affected their sense of safety and hope. The conversation was difficult and often painful. There were moments of raw anger at the school administration for not doing enough, at the students who had bullied James, at the mental health systems that had failed to provide adequate support. But there were also moments of unexpected beauty as the community members shared stories about James's impact on their lives and their commitment to honoring his memory through action. Unlike their experience at St. Margaret's Center, where the young people had been primarily focused on their own healing journeys, this gathering was dealing with acute grief and trauma. The emotional intensity was much higher, and the anger was more prominent. But William and Kate's months of practice with presence-based support served them well. when angry parents demanded to know why the royal family hadn't done more to address youth mental health before James's death. William and Kate didn't offer defensive explanations or list their charitable work. Instead, they acknowledged the legitimacy of the anger and asked to learn more about what systemic changes the parents thought were needed. When students expressed guilt about not recognizing how much James was struggling, Kate didn't offer reassuring platitudes about how they weren't responsible. Instead, she sat with them in their guilt and helped them explore how that painful emotion might be transformed into wisdom and commitment to support other struggling peers. The most powerful moment of the day came when James's younger sister, Emma, joined the gathering. She had been too upset to participate earlier, but hearing about the conversations taking place, she decided she wanted to share something about her brother. "Everyone keeps talking about how sad James was," Emma said, her voice shaky but determined. "And he was sad sometimes, but he was also really, really kind and funny. And he loved making art that helped people feel less alone." She brought with her a sketchbook that James had been working on before his death, a series of drawings designed to help other teenagers understand and cope with anxiety and depression. The images were sophisticated in their psychological insight while remaining accessible and even humorous. James wanted to publish this as a mental health resource for other students, Emma continued. He called it the Messy Mind Manual because he said mental health shouldn't be this scary, clinical thing. It should be something we can talk about like any other part of being human. Looking through James's sketchbook, William and Kate realized they were seeing something unprecedented, a teenage mental health resource created by someone who had actually experienced these challenges, written in language that would resonate with other young people, illustrated with humor and hope rather than clinical detachment. "Emma," Kate said gently, "would your family be interested in exploring ways to make James's work available to other students? Not as a memorial, but as the living resource he intended it to be." The suggestion sparked an immediate and enthusiastic response from the gathered students and teachers. They began brainstorming ways to develop James's work into a peer support resource, with input from mental health professionals, but maintained in his authentic voice and artistic style. What had begun as a visit to offer condolences was transforming into something much more significant, a collaborative effort to honor James's life by continuing his work of helping other young people feel less alone in their struggles. As the official school day ended, the gathering naturally evolved. Some people left to attend to other obligations, but others chose to stay and continue the conversation. Parents arrived to pick up their children and found themselves drawn into discussions about mental health, bullying, and community support systems. William and Kate made another unprecedented decision. They canceled their planned evening return to London and asked to extend their stay overnight so they could continue participating in what had become an organic community healing process. The evening session moved to the school's main hall, where a larger group gathered to continue exploring how James's death might catalyze positive changes in how the school and broader community addressed youth mental health challenges. The conversations were no longer primarily about grief, though grief remained present throughout. Instead, they focused on practical questions. How could schools create better systems for identifying and supporting struggling students? How could peer support networks be strengthened and made more visible to adults? How could mental health resources be made more accessible and less stigmatized? Dr. Chun, whom William and Kate had invited to join them via video call, offered guidance about trauma-informed approaches to systemic change. She emphasized that lasting change required involving the people most directly affected by the issues, in this case, students, as genuine partners in developing solutions rather than simply recipients of adult-designed interventions. As the evening progressed, something remarkable happened. The intense grief and anger that had characterized the earlier conversations began to transform into determination and hope. Not because the pain had been resolved, Emma and her family were still devastated by James's death, but because the community was discovering its capacity to respond to tragedy with wisdom and action. The turning point came when one of James's former bullies, a student named Connor, approached the microphone during the open discussion portion of the evening. The room fell silent, unsure what to expect from someone who had contributed to James's suffering. "I don't know if I should be here," Connor began, his voice barely audible. "I know I was part of the problem. I said things to James that I can never take back." The silence in the room was tense, but William and Kate had learned to trust that difficult moments often led to important breakthroughs if people were given space to work through them. "But I want you to know," Connor continued, "that I'll never forgive myself for how I treated him. And I want to do whatever I can to make sure no other student has to go through what James went through because of people like me." Connor's confession opened the door for one of the most powerful conversations of the day. Other students who had participated in bullying behaviors came forward to acknowledge their actions and commit to change. The discussion that followed wasn't about forgiveness. That wasn't something that could be rushed or demanded, but about accountability and the possibility of transformation. Emma, James's sister, eventually responded to Connor's confession. "I'm not ready to forgive you," she said honestly, "but I'm glad you're here." James would want his death to mean that things change, not just that people feel guilty. Her words seemed to release something in the room. The focus shifted from guilt and blame to the practical work of creating change. Students began organizing peer support networks. Teachers committed to additional training in mental health awareness. Parents discussed ways to address bullying behavior at home and in the community. By the time the evening concluded, a comprehensive action plan had emerged from the community's collective wisdom. The plan included immediate changes, like the implementation of James's messy mind manual as a peer resource, and longer-term goals, such as restructuring the school's approach to mental health support and bullying prevention. Most importantly, the community had committed to maintaining the quality of honest, sustained conversation that had characterized this day. They would meet monthly to assess progress, share challenges, and continue learning from each other about how to create an environment where students like James could thrive. As William and Kate finally prepared to leave Manchester the following morning, they reflected on how fundamentally the experience had challenged their understanding of leadership and public service. They had arrived expecting to provide comfort to a grieving community. Instead, they had witnessed a community's capacity to transform tragedy into wisdom, pain into purpose. The traditional measures of royal visit success, positive media coverage, minimal controversy, uplifting photo opportunities, were largely irrelevant to what had actually happened. Instead, they had participated in something much more valuable, authentic human connection that created real possibility for positive change. Emma approached them as they were leaving, carrying a folder filled with her brother's artwork. "I want you to take some of James's drawings with you," she said. "Not to remember your visit here, but to remember what you learned about how to help people who are struggling." As they drove away from Manchester, William and Kate carried with them not just James's artwork, but a profound understanding of their purpose that would reshape the monarchy's approach to mental health advocacy for generations to come. They had discovered that their most powerful impact came not from their ability to provide solutions or comfort, but from their willingness to be present with people in their most difficult moments and to trust in the community's capacity for healing and transformation. The silence in their car as they traveled back to London wasn't empty or uncomfortable. It was full, pregnant with new understanding, heavy with responsibility, and bright with possibility. They had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing leaders could do was create space for other people's wisdom to emerge, and that the most healing presence was one that honored both pain and hope without trying to resolve the tension between them. In the months that followed, their approach to royal duties would never be the same. They had discovered something that would revolutionize not just their individual work, but the institution they represented, the transformative power of authentic presence, and the revolutionary act of sustained listening in a world that demanded quick solutions and immediate responses. Most importantly, they had learned that true service sometimes meant being willing to have their own perspectives fundamentally changed by the people they were meant to serve, and that the most lasting impact often came not from what they said, but from the quality of attention they brought to listening.